Welcome to another episode of Expanding Unconsciousness. I am Mark Serto, and as always, I'm very happy to be sitting in this chair and speaking with you today. This gig is amazing. I get to speak with and learn from our guests, many of whom are brilliant scientists who are on the forefront of consciousness studies. I include today's guest in that category. In just a few minutes, I will be speaking with Dr. Monica Gagliano. Monica's story is a chapter in the story of consciousness, which I believe you will find amazing. She has a lot to offer on both a personal and professional level. Frankly, I find that all of our guests do, and the more of these interviews that I do, the more I get to learn about the people behind the scientific studies and the theories that they're presenting, the more I'm in awe about this thing that we call consciousness. Each of them has a story to tell that's letting us know that something is occurring in the zeitgeist or the spirit of our age. From my perspective, collectively, we are undergoing a paradigm shift in how we understand the nature of consciousness. We're learning something about it which has kind of been hinted at, but remained undefined for some time, thousands of years, in fact. And that is that consciousness is more than our personal sense of it. Evidence of this can be found in the conversations that you hear in Season 1. The psi experiments, the psychokinesis, remote viewing, the channeling, energetic healing, out-of-body experiences, lucid dream experiences, all of these have one thing in common, and that is consciousness. So each of these stories you've heard are reports from a personal consciousness, a person telling a story, speaking about a form of connecting to things which are outside of themselves in very non-ordinary ways through the mechanism, if I can call it that, of consciousness. And that implies that consciousness itself is outside of our personal sense of it. It's outside of our brains. And if you're following these conversations in sequence, you've just heard two quantum theorists talk about how consciousness is not in the brain, that it exists outside of it. So the scientists that we've spoken to thus far are all kind of finding the same thing out. And what they seem to be finding is that there's like a field surrounding everything, perhaps connecting everything, like the Force in Star Wars movies. And numerous other hero's journey type themes have echoed this idea over the ages. That theory of there being an impersonal or collective consciousness is actually pretty old now. As I've said many times in these interviews and in the monologues, mystics have spoken about this phenomenon forever. This idea is part of the collective human consciousness because of these stories that we've told through the ages. In religions, for instance, it's akin to the omnipresence of the divine. I'm fascinated by that. Early on, it made me wonder why such stories were told across cultures. It brought to mind questions like, what is this chi or prana or life force that is spoken of in the East? What is this omnipresence of the divine? Was this conscious, this force? As I told you in the primer, I've always been a curious kid on the subject of consciousness. The fact that science could be applied to these questions was a revelation to me, which I became part of upon meeting and working with Bob Monroe at the Monroe Institute. It was also very nice for me to come upon a myriad of other very strange people like myself who wanted to know the truth of such things. In addition to having extensive conversations with people who were much smarter than I at the time on the subject of consciousness, I was also introduced to the idea that consciousness And I'm referring to the greater consciousness, that force now, could actually be interacted with. This is probably for two main reasons. One, that we're all part of this greater consciousness, and that this consciousness is also a part of me and all of you listening today. Now, creating a scientific method of interacting with consciousness has always been a bit of a project for me, and it's taken me down some pretty strange and previously unexplored caverns, or as they like to say these days, rabbit holes. This exploration has been a part of my personal journey and something that I contribute now to the story of consciousness. Through this story, I have attained elements of self-actualization and self-realization. I say elements because, well, frankly, I'm still a work in progress. Haven't attained enlightenment just yet. Funny thing about this journey, once you jump in, some sort of interaction does seem to take place between one's personal sense of consciousness and this field or impersonal consciousness which surrounds everything. And very strange things occur as a result. All of them quite meaningful. This can take the form of new people popping into your life, but it's not always just new people, but also interesting situations and circumstances, opportunities which seem to arise out of nowhere, meaningful coincidences, or as Jung called them, synchronicities. So I intro today's guest with this preamble because you're about to meet one such person, a scientist with a passion to study life, and as a result, stumbled on a secret about consciousness. In the process of her following her North Star, she too attained elements of self-actualization and self-realization. And she did so through training plants. Here's my interview with Dr. Monica Gagliano. My guest today is Dr. Monica Gagliano. She's an evolutionary biologist and scientist with a PhD conducting research at the University of Western Australia, where she began her work as a marine scientist studying the Great Barrier Reef. This work led her to research plant intelligence. Dr. Gagliano is an associate professor of evolutionary ecology in the Biological Intelligence Lab at Southern Cross University. She's also a research affiliate at the Sydney Environmental Institute, University of Sydney. Over the years, she's published numerous articles and studies suggesting that plants are indeed conscious sentient beings who interact with their environments and communicate with each other. Dr. Gagliano, welcome to the conversation. It is a real pleasure to finally meet you.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
I was looking forward to this because I find that your story is such a fantastic story of self-realization and self-actualization combined with a science and eye-opening revelation that took me to a brand new place. I've spent most of my life being conscious that plants were alive. But beyond that, I had no understanding. I came upon your research through a documentary called Awake, which is essentially about human consciousness. And your work, however, seems to extend the notion of consciousness to plants, which I found absolutely fascinating. I was somewhat familiar with the idea that plants communicate with each other, but I'm finding so much more about plants. Your work indicates that plants are not only quite aware of their environment, but they also learn and adapt through a form of decision-making, which I found incredibly impressive. It shifts their behavior. My first question to you is to have you tell the audience about your experiments with plants. How did you conduct these experiments? What were you hoping to discover when you began?
First of all, I wasn't hoping anything, and this is why that's why they worked. Because initially when I started this work, it was out of curiosity. I'm an animal ecologist by training, as you said, and of course, in the animal area of research, this kind of question of whether an organism is alive and makes decision and chooses between things and communicate that information and how they learn that information, is kind of like, it's a normal thing that we do. And I was just, when I shifted from working with marine fishes to the plants, I carried with me the same questions that I was already asking when I was working with the fish, and but this time were plants that I was asking them about. And initially, I just looked into the literature, the scientific literature, to see if these questions were already being asked. And as you can imagine, the answer was clearly a resounding no. But we're talking about just strictly the scientific literature.
Right.
Those who had attempted to ask similar question, I would say they never made it through the academic environment. And
please allow me to interject. What was the essential question that you were with the
essential
marine
question
life?
is like, with my marine fishes, I was looking at communication. I was already looking at how sound mediates survivorship, and whether they were using sound to orientate and use their environment in a way that supported flourishing. And then, of course, also to behavioral components of like particularly my research was about the relationship between mothers and offsprings. And so how do the decisions the mom makes at a certain time impact what will happen to their babies, basically.
I see, yes.
And so these are all questions of, behavioral interactions with others, whether they're the same species, other species, how these interactions are mediated through communicating different signals, and also levels of stress from these interactions, as we know well as well. Not all interactions are good and healthy.
That's correct.
And so these were the kind of things that I was already studying as an animal ecologist. And when I moved to plants, I kind of taken the same question and brought them into the plant sphere. And when you look at communication, it's a little bit easier because there was actually, to my own good surprise, some work already done. And of course, there was a legacy, which scientists didn't think it was a good legacy, from the 60s. People had tried to, plug in plants with, electrode and see whether they could speak to us or something. So that work, actually, for the science that we're doing now, has been kind of a burden, really, because scientists, I think, they take themselves too seriously sometimes, and they can't see, that actually this might not be how we would do it now, because we have different technologies and different approaches. But the idea, it's worth pursuing. The idea, it's worth exploring more.
Right.
And instead, what we have done for decades is to just throw everything out. So baby and bath out of the window. And now it's a way of trying to rescue the baby and maybe build a new bathtub for it. And so this is what I guess I ended up doing. I ended up rescuing those questions because were the same question that I had. And then over time, I discovered were the same question that many scientists and non-scientists alike have. And we actually haven't dared asking and seeing whether what kind of answer we might encounter. And when I set up to do my first few experiments were primarily on communication and whether the plants would be able to perceive their environment as specific information and then act on it. And it was very clear, I'm not a botanist, I'm not a plant physiologist, I didn't know anything about plants. I'm a good experimentalist, so I can design very well the experiments. And it was very clear from the beginning for me that it's like, these guys or ladies are very good at picking up information and changing what they're doing. Of course, there are many aspects to consider. The first one, as we all know, like plants to us appear immobile.
Right.
So just because their time frame is so different. They live in a different time world.
Right.
And so from ours. And so for us to appreciate that becomes very difficult unless we either use technology like, speed cameras that allows us to time lapse them and see them in their own time, speed up a bit, or we need to slow down, one of the two.
Right.
And of course, time lapse is being used before, and I thought it was worth maybe trying to slow down. And rather than force the plant to enter our world, see if I could force myself to enter theirs.
Right.
And in the process, of course, I think it's more of an encounter between these two worlds, and rather than a discovering of anything, because the two worlds are already there. There is nothing to be discovered.
Right.
And so then when I approach the plants in terms of like more directly in terms of learning and decision making, then I had to make some kind of strategic decisions of who would be my collaborator for these kind of questions, because I knew that if I was to find something, he needed to be a very strong case. Otherwise, it would just be, the baby in the bath will go out of the window again. And so my first experiment in the learning sphere with the plants was with Mimosa. And the reason why this is the perfect plants to open the field is because this is one of the few plants that we know that moves in our time sphere, in our time scale. And so we can literally, we don't need cameras, we don't need anything. We can see it with our own eyes, and we can interact with it without needing to mediate our interaction with technology, for example.
Right.
And so Mimosa was great. And I again borrowed the framework that we use to test learning. In this case was what we define the most basic level of learning, habituation, although there is nothing basic about it because we still don't know many things about how habituation actually work. So, and Mimosa was the collaborator in this project, and and he was not only very good at learning what me, crazy scientist, was doing for her, but also she remembered very, very rapidly. She learned very, very good. She remembered, and for a long while.
So tell the audience what you taught Mimosa to do.
Yeah, and then it would be more worthwhile speaking about what she taught me. But
well, we'll get to that. Yes, I want to know.
That's right. So Mimosa, okay, first of all, I should define, I guess, what I mean by habituation. So habituation is a form of learning.
Right.
As I said, in technical terms, we define it as the most basic form of learning, even if we still not really understand everything about this process. But we all do this. And so we are all familiar with what this process is about. So, for example, if you are in a room and your fridge is buzzing or the air conditioner is doing its little humming noise, we're not going to pay attention to all of these noises and all of these signals all the time because, first of all, I think we will just burn out. Our nervous system will fry pretty quickly. But also, it makes no sense to waste our energy paying attention to something that over time, because of repetition and repeated experience, we have learned that, actually nothing happens when the fridge is humming or the air conditioner is humming.
Not life-threatening.
I don't have to concern myself. That's right. When it becomes when the noise changes, or maybe if an alarm goes off, then our attention is immediately there, and we know that we need to pay attention. So it's this ability to ignore, but also be still aware and pay attention to anything new that arrives in the environment that potentially could be threatening.
Right.
So in the case of
Mimosa, we habituate to our environment when we are not threatened.
That's right. That's right. So we ignore the things that we know is no problem. I mean, imagine if you were not to ignore the sound of the traffic, or it would just drive us nuts. And I don't think we will be able to sleep. I don't think we will be able to function. And that's why this process is actually a really crucial, fundamental process as part of the learning sphere. And So, of course, habituation underpins two very important things. One, you need to be able to be responsive, quickly responsive, if your environment is telling you that there is something potentially dangerous.
Right.
And two, you also need to be able to ignore that. Otherwise, you might waste your energy and you're reacting to something instead of doing something else that would be most useful.
Productive.
So in the case of that's right. In the case of Mimosa, for example, when the Mimosa respond to interference or noises and potential predator or dangerous signals by folding her leaves. And as I said, she does this behavior in our own time scale. So we can see these. And if we touch the plant, she will close the leaves.
Okay.
And if she feels really threatened, she would even droop. And I say that she plays dead because it looks really like this miserable plant that looks half dead. But I think this is exactly what the plant is intention is.
Right. Is to evoke compassion?
I think it's actually like, look, I'm not worth your time, you know?
Yeah. Leave me alone.
If
I'm
you are
just
a predator.
Right.
That's right.
I don't taste very good, right?
That's right.
Okay.
It's like, first I'll close my leaf and I'll show you my spine.
Okay.
And if that's not good enough for you, then I will droop and you'll be like, oh, well, this is not worth my while.
Not very tasty.
I think is the hope. Okay. That's right. Go and get someone else juicier over there.
Right.
Okay, so this is what the mechanism is for. It's a defensive mechanism. But of course, it comes with a cost because when the leaves are folded, the plants cannot photosynthesize as efficiently. So I think the photosynthesis rate is cut down by 40-60%. Wow. That's a lot.
Yeah, it is.
So basically, you're eating half ration of your food.
Right.
So you see, there is like, it's important to be able to react immediately to a clue from your environment that could indicate danger. Because otherwise you lose your life by not responding appropriately.
Right.
But it's also very important at the same time not to react to something that over the time of experience, you have worked out that it is not dangerous. It might be annoying, but it's not dangerous.
Right.
Because otherwise you might starve yourself.
Right,
and
you're cutting off your food supply.
Exactly.
Sure. Right.
So what Mimosa was asked to do through the experimentation, I create a little contraption where there was a little vessel into which I put the mimosa in a pot.
Right.
And this little vessel was attached to a metal strip, basically, which would allow the vessel to be lifted and then slide down. And like a little train.
Okay.
And the vessel was dropped basically into like a very soft foamy base, and not very much, like 15 centimeters. That's what, maybe a couple of inches.
Right, sure.
And but it was enough to startle the plant without damaging the plant. So of course, when you do, the reason why I chose this as a test is because, as I said, habituation works based on your experience.
Right.
So if the plant had already experienced something, when I go and test it for it might not respond because it's like, I already know this.
Right.
So it needed to be something totally outrageous, something that a plant in a normal everyday life doesn't experience.
Right.
And I said, okay, plants don't experience being dropped repeatedly. And that worked because as soon as we dropped the plant once, twice, the plant, of course, appropriately closed the leaves.
Right.
So it's like, whoa, this could be dangerous. I don't know yet because I haven't experienced this long enough. I don't know yet what this is.
Right.
And to protect myself, the best thing to do is to close my leaves.
Right.
And that's what the plant does. Now, when we do the work with animals, we will run this repeated event multiple times to give the organism a time literally to work out, actually, this is not dangerous. And actually now I'm habituated, I'm ignoring it.
Right.
And so we call this train. And this is my train for the mimosa was made up of 60 drops consecutive. So I put it down, and then bring it back up, let it go again, bring it back up, let it go again, and repeat this for 60 times.
Right.
Because when we look at the literature for animals, this is how much time we normally do things for. And I thought surely plants will need a long time because, they're so slow, and who knows, maybe they're not even that smart.
Right.
And instead, I was proven wrong immediately because, Mimosa closed the leaves for the first few drops. And then within a few seconds, really, of this torture, the plant started reopening the leaves.
That's amazing.
Which meant, I don't care about this. Right. I'm going to carry on feeding on light because this is actually already worked out. This is not dangerous.
You're interrupting my lunch, lady.
That's right. That's right. Oh, what was that? Oh, don't worry about it.
Right.
And of course, I'm still carry on finishing my train of 60 drops.
Right.
But within, the first 4-6 drops, the plant has already worked out everything.
4 to 6?
Yeah.
Wow.
Out of 60. So, I'm carry on dropping. And the plant is like, oh, dear, this is so boring.
Mimosa Pudica runs on real time and learns very quickly. That's astounding. That's astounding.
Yeah, the interesting part about this is that was my first learning, of course. It's you thought the plants are going to take ages to do things. Just because we live in a different time scale, it doesn't mean that we don't do fast things, even faster than you.
Right.
And then, of course, I repeated that throughout that day. I repeated that training session several times.
Okay.
And then I let them be. And I thought, I wonder how long these plants will remember this. And if you look at the literature in animals again, in bees, for example, we talk about long-term memory when bees have managed to remember something for 48 hours.
And yes.
So I thought, well, again, plants, slow ladies. I'm going to wait for 3 days. I'll just give them extra time, And 3 days later, they are remembering exactly perfectly as if I just did it 5 minutes ago.
That's so amazing.
So basically, I can't collect any data because nothing is happening. The plants are just like, no, we are just, we know what this is and we don't need to close.
Right. We're not going to perform for you anymore.
That's right. It's like, we're refusing.
Right.
So then I extended the time, of course, another 3 days. So we are like day 6, still nothing.
6 days.
So then I thought, okay, fine. So what I did is because in the experiment, I had an extra layer of design. And so there were 2 groups. One group, they all experienced the same training, but one group was held under relatively low light, like the minimum enough just to survive.
Right.
While the other group of plants was held in an environment that was very abundant of light. So light was not a limiting factor.
Right.
Now, as we know well, when we have a deadline, for example, so a little bit of pressure, we perform.
Yeah.
And if we don't have a deadline, we are most likely to procrastinate and just I'll just do it tomorrow. It's
bask
not in a
in the
hurry.
sunlight, right? Correct.
That's right. That's right, literally. So this is exactly what I saw with my plants. The one they were in the environment that was, let's say, more demanding because the light was not as abundant. So it was more a limiting factor potentially.
Right. Learned
faster and remembered longer. While the plants that were in an environment that had plenty of light, they were they still learned, but it took them a few more drops before they're like, all right, I get it, all right. And then they remember just slightly less for less time. Now, so because of this layer, when I worked out, it's like, oh, these guys are really good at remembering and they're not forgetting. And I want to know when you don't remember anymore.
Right.
So what I did, I divided the 2 groups that I had of the 2 light environments in half. So let's say in the low light environment, half of the plants remained where they were. So they remain in the same environment that they were trained into. while the other half of that group got moved to the other environment. So they were trained in low light environment, but now suddenly they found themselves in a good environment with lots of light.
And nothing will stress an organism more than a shift in environment, of course. So
that's right. That's right. And the same I did, of course, with the other group. So half of the group in the good environment with lots of light remained there. And the other half of the group got moved to now the crappy environment where things are not as hot as they were.
The low rent district.
That's right. So now I leave them there. And this time it's like, fine, I'm going to leave them for a month and see what they do after that. Surely, after a month and after all of these like swapping around and moving you around, they will be so totally confused and they will not remember anything. No, that's not how the story goes.
How long of a memory does a Mimosa Pudica have?
Well, I can certainly tell you that it can remember for the very least a month.
That's
and
so
then
amazing.
I ran out of time in the lab.
Yeah, right.
So I couldn't carry on. It's like I've been in there for months already, and my time, we book time in the laboratories, and they're often very busy, and so someone else had already booked after me, and I had to get out. I had to go. So the experiment was over, and the interesting thing of this is like so overall, Mimosa remembered, I would say, perfectly. A month later after the experience. And not only that, but what was interesting is that the plants that I moved, so the plants that remained in their own environment were just like, yep, no problem here. The plants that I moved were the one that gave some interesting insights, because the plant that went from a good light environment and went to a poor light environment, as one might expect.
Right.
You went from something where it's okay and you can afford to be relaxed about it.
Right.
And now suddenly it's like, the environment has changed. Maybe I can't afford to be so relaxed about it.
Right, I have to work a little harder.
That's right. Their memory and their ability to perform goes up.
That's amazing.
And it matches the same as the one that were already in the low light environment. But the interesting thing is about the other group. So if you're a plant that goes from a low light environment, so you had a hard start, let's say,
right,
and then suddenly you find yourself in a good light environment,
right,
you would think like now you can relax,
right,
but they don't. And I think
habituate to early childhood development or something.
That's right.
Oh my God.
I think that there is a trace that is remaining from the environment itself, the quality of the environment, and basically the learning is both in that context, but also it allows them to, this is my interpretation, I think that they are able to expect that the environment might turn back to bad again.
Because that would be a long memory in the life of a plant, right?
That's right. And so like I've experienced a bad environment before. Now the environment is going good, which is great. But it could turn bad again. And I know what that means. So I'm just going to stay. I'm not going to just relax. I'm just going to stay as,
Right. I'm going to save my pennies because you never know when a rainy day might show up, which would be a good thing for a plant, of course. But
that's right.
I mean, to use a human analogy, I am more agape than I was watching the documentary of Awake and listening to all of the numerous presentations that you've done on this. I'm personally blown away and think that I need a moment to integrate. Let's take a moment to allow the audience to grab a popcorn and hear a few words from our sponsor. We'll be back with Dr. Monica Gagliano in just a moment. Stay tuned.
Expanding on Consciousness is brought to you by the Monroe Institute, a nonprofit organization and leader in consciousness education and research, teaching you how to actively explore and use expanded states of consciousness, providing direct experiences that are deeply personal, uniquely meaningful, and life-changing. Monroe has been helping people create more meaningful and joyful lives through the guided exploration of expanded consciousness for 50 years. Gain the knowledge and understanding you seek to create the life you desire. Learn more about where to start your journey to expanded awareness with Monroe. Visit monroeinstitute.org or check out our Expand Meditation app, available on the App Store or Google Play.
Memory. Not only stimulus and response, rod and carrot, learning procedure, an awareness of an environment, but memory as well.
That's right.
And this was not exclusive to Mimosa Pudica. This was repeated by other plants as well when I talk about the behavior of learning and communication. You've worked with corn plants, you've worked with peas. I was rocked by the field pea experiment, where you took the transducer and replaced the water source with the sound of water. Tell the audience what you did there and what the findings were.
My added torture, I have to say, as I always say, I make clear, like, no plants were hurt in the proceeding of these studies, you know.
Well, you
I
don't know. You haven't spoken to their therapist. Right. they may have long trauma from this.
I do always, because I never use any chemicals or any nasty stuff, and I always plant them in good organic soil. So then when I finish the experiments, I always put them in a little box and I put a sign, and I usually give them to colleagues and go around with my box. It's like, anybody wants to adopt a famous plant, because these plants are famous. And so I actually know the first experiment I did was with chili plants, and many years later, and so I went around in the various departments distributing chili plants, and then many years later, I received an email from a colleague who, a lady that took some of the plants at home and planted them in her garden. And she must have seen, I don't know, maybe a presentation or interview. So she must remember, like, oh, that's Monica who gave me the plant.
Right.
And so she sent me an email and she said, like, Monica, I don't know if you remember me. I'm from such and such school. And one day you came about and you were distributing like chili plants. Well, I took some of your chili plants and they're still going and they're really happy. So I have proof that my babies are doing just fine.
That's nice. You have a certificate of humanity. That goes with your, okay, so you're a humane researcher. I'm very interested to know, I'm interested to know 1,000 things now, because like so many humans walking on the earth, passing all the plant life, giving it very little consideration, enjoying it for what it was, but being that it's stationary, my consciousness, as I experience plants, is that they're stationary and they're part of the earth itself, like dirt.
Yep.
I, however, am mobile. I am ambulatory. I am a conscious being walking upon the earth, expressing dominion. Plants don't have this ability. Ergo, my assumption is that I have a different or superior, if I may use that language, consciousness to a plant. Like an animal, I can train an animal. I can do things. I notice that animal is conscious. I can teach a dog through stimulus and response, using a rod and a carrot, treats and rewards or correction when necessary, and train that animal to do all sorts of things. And their memory seems to be fairly long. But plants, I never in my life considered that they had that sort of consciousness, because they don't have brains. This is an assumption that I think we need to start exploring. You can verify, as a scientist, that plants do not have brains, right?
Absolutely no brain, no neurons. That's for sure.
Yet they are exhibiting what we will call consciousness. I'm putting a very pregnant pause there for the audience. This is a species that is exhibiting consciousness without a brain. How does that work?
Well, as humans, we are still to learn a lot of things.
Apparently.
And we won't be able to learn anything if we are remaining stuck with assumptions which are proving to be actually incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the methodology of science. So this is a very scientific process to revise and evaluate and revise its own assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
And not doing that, it's actually not scientific.
Science. Right.
That's
scientism. Correct.
That's right. Or like pseudoscience, or, whatever we want to call it. And so ironically, what the evidence is that emerge about plants is showing us is that, as you correctly said, plants can do exactly the same as our dog does when he's learning a new trick. That is with associative learning, for example, which I tested on a pea plant, and the pea plant passes with flying colors. So plants can definitely have that kind of learning, the very same kind of learning that you are thinking of about training your dog with. So,
yes, or people.
That's right.
People learn through stimulus and response. They respond to their environment.
That's
One of the best definitions that I've heard, and I call it the best definition because I'm an artist and I can be abstract. The best definitions of consciousness that I've heard are cortical stimulation through sensory awareness as a compendium with memory. So we're talking about information coming in through the senses, stimulating the cortices, including the memory cortex, and we come to conclusions. We derive meaning from our information coming in. That is something that I'm hearing the plants are doing.
Well, actually, no. And fortunately not.
Tell me, I know they don't have brains, so we have to omit cortices, cortical stimulation from that formula or equation. What is happening?
Even the formula might be incorrect for us too.
Well, talk about that. Tell me what you mean.
So what you just described, some people have described it as the cognitive sandwich.
Right.
And so you have input, processing, output.
Right.
The input, of course, the information from the environment. The processing is the processor, the brain.
Right.
And then the output is the behavioral action that we take as a consequence of what we have just received. And now, of course, as you can see, this model is very cybernetic as well, because you can put a computer in there, input, processor, output, and it would work.
Right.
And this actually comes from the cybernetics movement from the 60s.
Okay.
And which saw in the cognition realm, like this was the cognitivist approach.
Right.
And it literally sees the process of cognition, which includes learning, memory, communication, decision-making, all of those under the same umbrella. And he speaks of them as if they are a linear process of in, process, out. But this is most likely not how any system, including ourselves and including plants, actually works. And in fact, there has been always a counter movement to the cognitivist view, which was the post-cognitive view. The Varela and Maturana, and all sorts of people who have spoken. And this is, now we have Evan Thompson and many others who have spoken very clearly about the idea that the system of cognition might not be linear. Why should it be linear?
Yes.
And if it's not linear, it might actually be not even as closed as we see it, because the processing in the middle, the middle of the sandwich is actually separate from the environment or the action. And he preserves this idea, he conserves this idea that what's happening inside here is got nothing to do with what's happening out there, both in and out. But the reality, as we all know very well, is not actually like that.
We are going to get down a very deep rabbit hole if we keep going on this line. But please continue. I'm loving it. Go ahead.
So what's happening if you take a more post-cognitive approach is that you see that the system is an open system. First of all, it's not closed.
Right.
As an open system, every component is open and permeable and interacting with every other component. So there are, I interact with the environment and the environment interacts with me. And both internally and externally, we are co-creating each other all the time. And if that's the case, then whether you have a brain or, lymph inside or whatever it is that you are made of, or the structures that you're made of are kind of like, they are specific to the system, but they are inconsequential for the model to work.
Yeah, they're inconsequential to consciousness.
That's right. So suddenly it's like, it doesn't matter whether you're a plant or a human. The human will do it in a human way. And in the human way, we use brains and neural system to do certain things. In a plant world, the plant will do it in a plant way. And fundamentally, actually, it's very interesting because even the nervous system is basically an electrochemical system.
Right.
And plants are electrochemical too, like all the rest of life.
Right.
So even there, it's almost like we haven't... The idea that the brain is critical for any form of cognition and then consciousness, which is, I think, even a further step away. But if we stick with cognition for a minute, it's like even the idea that the brain is, cognition is contingent to the brain and neurons. It's like we have evidence to show the contrary. So that is an assumption.
Yes.
And if the scientific evidence demonstrates that the assumption is incorrect, you don't throw away the data, you throw away the assumption. But we're finding that very difficult.
Progress happens by funerals, unfortunately.
That's right. I'm waiting for some. Sorry, but...
No, I think it's important for us to have this conversation now and to speak about it and challenge the current assumptions. I cannot do that because I'm a recording engineer and a musician and an artist who's been involved in consciousness studies. Your ilk, however, and the work that you're doing can change that paradigm. You and the physicists who are talking about what is occurring from a assumption being that consciousness is fundamental. Something that philosophers have been talking about and mystics have been talking about for a very long time.
That's right. This is where I think is this assumption that the brain and the neurons are necessary for the cognitive process and then for the arising of cognition really seems actually very primitive. It feels very basic and not very profound at all. In the sense that it doesn't have any... Yeah, it doesn't have any foundation really to what's really happening. It's a very superficial take on what's happening. You're looking on the surface and it looks like that, but actually you just need to do a little bit more digging, both with your mind in terms of knowledge and with the body in terms of practices, as you said. Like we have been thinking and experiencing consciousness and pondering what this consciousness is for a very long time.
Yes.
And I would say that the most obvious answer is that no, it doesn't arise from any brain or any neuron, but it's the brain and the neurons that are informed by cognition. And literally, like, cognition is a field that put into form by placing information in a particular shape, which becomes, this is Monica now.
Yes.
So plants are no different.
Yes, and you would have the support of a lot of physicists who are involved in quantum field theory and understand that consciousness is fundamental, who would probably be very interested to see these experiments or become aware of these experiments. I would like to introduce you to some of them. So for all of your new experience with Mimosa Pudica, excuse me on my Latin, who taught you something, How do you now define consciousness?
Well, actually, I would say that there are a lot of plants who have taught me a lot.
Well, we'll give them proper credit then. Yes, okay.
And both in the lab and outside the lab. And some of them have informed what I did in the lab. So I feel like they are my co-author and they should be acknowledged. I would like to refrain, like on purpose, I would like to refrain from defining consciousness, in the sense that I find myself not able to. Or it's not that I can't. Of course, I could put words there that point to something,
right.
But my experience always brings me to the same place, that there are some things that our words are very poor at describing. And describing what consciousness is, it feels like the words are bound to fail even from the start.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that first and foremost is an experience, and we are having it all the time.
I agree with you. And obviously, your sense of consciousness, your experience of consciousness has changed quite a lot in your experience with plants. I heard you speak of plants informing your research.
Mm-hmm.
I know that they, in many ways, informed the book you wrote, which is called Thus Spoke the Plant. Tell me about your feelings about life and consciousness as you experience it personally now, having shifted through the ages. Let's start with young Monica. What were you interested in? What really informed you as a child? What moved you?
I grew up in Italy, in a very industrial part of Italy, actually, just outside on the outskirts of Turin. I grew up in an apartment, and there was no garden, and everything was concrete. So for me, the connection with nature in general, plants and animals and other critters, was kind of, only every so often.
Novel.
It wasn't always there.
Right.
And in fact, I'm still very envious of people who grew up in country like Australia, or probably even in the US, where people grew up like, running around in the fields, and like, it's like, I wanted to do that.
Yeah.
But that's okay. I think it was necessary to shape, of course, who I am, so that then I could offer what I've come to offer. Now, when I was little, I would have animals in cages and tanks. And that would be the closest to nature that I would get. So I had a little bird, and I had a little fish, a goldfish. And at the time, and now I'm cringing at the idea, but at the time I thought like, well, at least I can love this,
Right.
And of course, they all received a very sumptuous funeral when they passed. Despite my mom just wanted to flush the fish down the toilet. And I was like, you can't do that.
Exactly.
And so I made him a little coffin in paper, drew on it, and then put it, dug a hole under a tree in the middle of the road, and put it at the tree. So whatever was available, I connected to, or I used as a connection point.
So you had the connection to nature, and it developed a sense of empathy with the natural world.
Whatever I had,
right. Right.
When
While
I
you
was
lived
in
in the
school,
concrete jungle. I grew up in a
That's
concrete
right.
jungle too. New York City.
That's right. So you would know. And when I was at school, I think it was during primary school, and I think they probably still do this kind of experiments for the school kids. We were told to do this experiment with, cotton wool and beans. And so you put the borlotti beans between 2 layers of cotton wool, you put some water, and then you observe what happened.
Right.
And many years later, I found this little notebook where I had, the date, what's happening to the beans.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I was a scientist from the beginning. If the scientist is defined as someone that observe and pay attention to the movements around, in nature. And then, of course, there was this deep craving for this connection. It wasn't enough for me to have the goldfish and the bird in the cage.
Right.
And I would spend time with my grandma, and we would go, she was a nurse, and we would go in the field collecting herbs. Of course, all of this memory came back to me much later. At the time, I just saw every grandma does this.
Right.
And there I really loved to just be in the fields collecting, dandelions. And I don't even know what other herbs she was picking up and making things with. And then, of course, as soon as I could, I left and went to university to study. And it was very clear for me, it's like I want to be close to the ocean. Because, of course, I grew up near the mountains, so I needed to be close to the ocean.
Right.
And I became a marine scientist, a marine biologist.
Right.
Through that process, a uni that I was able to really spend time and learn about, nature and be able to, I had the perfect excuse now, I had to study it. Sorry, I had to be there.
Right.
And it's even funny now that I think about it, that I felt I had to have an excuse, a reason to be there. I couldn't just be there, And my parents didn't really spend any time in nature, so I guess that's probably where it comes from. But I suppose that many still feel that, that you need to have a weekend to go to nature, and then you go to the national park. Otherwise, the rest of the week, nature doesn't matter. And so for me, it became very clear, now I got the perfect excuse, and I can go to nature, and I can spend time with nature, and I can observe nature. And I was obsessed with the sea and the ocean. And I came to Australia to do my PhD on the Great Barrier Reef. And I spent half of the year underwater, most of the day in the water, getting lost in nature. And I really loved it.
I'm curious to know if at any point in your transition from young Monica involved with, her connection with her caged animals and her empathy that she was developing and the experiences with grandma, were there any points in your life where you found the perfect opportunities arising in order for you to eventually end up at the ocean? You called it an excuse, a reason. And my experience of the self-actualized person is that self-actualization and self-realization take place in a very organic and interesting unfolding way that sometimes, how shall I say this? That sometimes appears almost magical. The circumstances that lead one through the path of one point to another point. Do you have experiences like that in your young life?
I have, all my life is like that. Still now, it's people are asking, how do you do it? And it's I don't do anything. Literally, that's why it happens, But I do follow when the little message is left, or when I see the sign, I'll follow it.
And when did those messages start coming to you?
I think they were always there. And I always follow them within the constraint of my environment. Mm-hmm. And then as the constraint started to loosen up because I was growing and I could make my own decision more, then I had more space to just follow things that looked wilder than before. And they are getting wilder and wilder as you get along.
Yes. And to quote John Lennon, quoting the Maharishi, the deeper you go, the higher you fly, the higher you fly, the deeper you go. So come on, it's such a joy. Be sure to tune in next week when Dr. Gagliano shares her magical mystery tour of consciousness with us. Till then, I encourage you to keep climbing and I'll see you all next week.
Be certain to tune in again to Expanding on Consciousness to become informed on the fascinating field of consciousness studies and its applications. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the guests and the host. They do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Monroe Institute. Expanding on Consciousness is underwritten and produced by the Monroe Institute, copyright 2022, and is broadcast by permission. Reproduction or redistribution without the express written consent of Monroe Institute is prohibited by law. For more information about Expanding on Consciousness, visit our website at monroeinstitute.org or connect with us on the socials. Thank you for listening.